This week on our Learning to Sew series, we are going to talk about the information on the instruction sheet of the pattern. We're going to look at the pattern pieces and we're going to cut out our pattern from our fabric. Stay tuned and see how easy this is to do. Alright, I've decided to start with this pattern of the two I showed you last week. I chose this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's done with woven fabrics. Woven fabrics are so much easier for the beginner to sew because they don't stretch. I'm going to be showing you how to make view C over the next couple of weeks. But today, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up this pattern envelope and see exactly what comes inside. And we're going to talk about each of these things in detail. Let's start with the instruction sheet. Every pattern you purchase should have a sheet of instructions in it. This one has 2 sheets of paper with 4 pages. And it tells you right here, this is page 1 of 4. Every page will have the simplicity and the number, so you can tell what pattern your instructions go to, even if they get separated from the envelope. The first section should be line drawings of the fronts and the backs of what the pattern makes, followed by line drawings of every pattern piece. That way you know what you're looking for. Underneath, and the pattern pieces are all numbered just like they are on the tissue paper. We'll get to those in a moment. And down here you have your guide to tell you that piece 25 is the yoke front and back for number F, which is this one. So it just, every pattern piece is labeled here. That way you know what they are and what they do. Next we have a section that talks about just general guidelines for cutting out your fabrics. We'll talk about these guidelines as we get ready to do our fabric. And then we have our layout diagrams. This is how the manufacturer recommends that you lay your pattern out. Sometimes I follow these, sometimes I don't, and I'll give you examples of when to follow and when not. Quite frankly, a lot of my doll clothes sewing I'm doing from scraps of fabric left over from other projects, so I can't use these diagrams for those. But they're still a guideline, and if you've never sewn before, they're a good place to start so you make sure you get everything done correctly. When you turn this page over, we start getting the directions. We get some sewing directions that are just kind of general directions for using the pattern. It will tell you things like how to make specific seams, how to do things specifically you'll need for this pattern. It should also tell you either here or on the pattern piece what seam allowance dimension this pattern is made for. Something you need to know, because if you use the wrong size seam allowance, things won't fit the way they're supposed to. After that, in order, since these are labeled by letter, you'll find the directions for view A first, then view B, C, D, etc. So here's where the directions for view A are. Then you have bag A, C, D, and F. Because it's the same bag, it's just done, it's decorated differently. And there's directions for B, and on through it. It shows you all the directions for all the pattern pieces, or all the pattern views that you're going to make. Let's look at our tissue paper patterns. Now, these are most patterns that we buy, at least in the U.S., we buy in the fabric store, are printed on this kind of tan colored tissue. And they're on very large sheets, and they're sometimes kind of wrinkled. So usually what I'll do, I'll open my sheets up, which I can't get it all under the camera at once. This one happens to be all on one piece of tissue. Now I'm going to go through. The first item I'm going to sew, since we're making C, I'm going to make the top for C. So I need to look here. That means I will need pieces 10, 11, 12, and 13, because 14C is for the pants. So 10, 11, 12, and 13. And I want my paper scissors. I don't use my fabric scissors to cut this out. I use my paper scissors. That way I'm using as little as possible on paper. So I'm going to kind of scan through here. Sometimes they're nice and they put them all together, and sometimes they don't. All right, I saw part of them. Here's 10, 11, 12, and 13 right there. I'm going to cut around them. Now, one thing I have found in many years of sewing is most of the time it's kind of difficult to get the pattern back in that paper envelope. So usually I will go get a gallon-size Ziploc storage bag from my kitchen, and I'll put my pattern contents all in that. That allows me a couple of things that are really handy later on. I can have all my adjusted pattern pieces there. Sometimes I will buy extras of a pattern and only keep part of the second one. Like here, piece 13, the sleeve, since some of the tops have longer sleeves than others, they cut the sleeve off. So we're going to need to cut it off to make our sleeve today, but if I have a second copy of the pattern, I can save the sleeve in the long size. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to take this to my ironing board, and I'm going to iron it flat. I'm actually going to cut it apart first so that it's easier to handle. I want to cut it down while I've got my paper scissors. But I like to press my pattern pieces with a dry, fairly hot iron. Just make sure you don't have any moisture in your iron, because you don't want to get the pattern pieces wet. But it's nice to have them pressed so it gets rid of all the creases from being folded up in the envelope. And I'm just kind of cutting roughly around my pattern pieces right now. I find it a good idea to press them flat before I start measuring them for fitting, because until they're pressed out, there's little folds. So let me go do that, and when I get them all pressed, I will come back and we will start measuring and fitting. Alright, so first off, you're going to notice some tape and different things. That's because this is my second time filming this portion of the video. I wasn't happy with how I explained things on the time I just filmed. So to prep for this portion, I did take these pattern pieces to my ironing board, and I ironed them with a dry iron, and then I cut them out right on the lines. I also marked, because this sleeve pattern, the pattern, we use the same sleeve pattern for C, D, and E. So C, D, and E. And in case I ever want to make D or E, I want to retain this piece. So what I did before I cut it off, I wrote on it that this is the sleeve bottom piece number 13. That way, if I ever need to, I can go back, I can tape this on, and I can use it if I want to make that type of sleeve again. So now, let's fit the pattern to the doll that we're going to use. And I've decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this for the American Girl in this series, and then I think I will see if I can get another copy of this pattern, of these two patterns, and adjust them to fit a Journey Girl or another thinner doll. So you can see how to go both ways. So, we have Allison here. I took her shirt off, and I want to see what I think about how this fits. Well, I can lay the pattern on. There's a couple ways I can do this. I can lay the pattern on and get a pretty good idea. I can lay this over here, keeping in mind that we've got seam allowances. And this pattern is plenty big around for this doll. The other way we can do that is we can measure the doll. We can take a tape measure, and we can measure around her. And I'm going to measure her pretty much right under her arms. And right under her arms, she measures about 10.5 inches. Okay, so let's look at our pattern pieces. Let's lay out the front pattern piece and the back pattern piece. And I'm going to overlap the seam allowances just a little bit so that they are lined up. Right, the sewing lines are lined up that way. I'm going to lay a pair of scissors on there so that I can have them stay fairly much where I want them. And I'm going to measure from the center back line to the middle. And that measures about 6.5 inches. Well, 6.5 inches is 13 inches when you fold it in half. So we've got extra room. That's plenty of room. I'm not going to take it in at this point. I might, when I make this in the future, I'm going to make one with the width it is. One thing though, looking at the pattern, I don't like the length of this top. I would rather see the top be just a little bit longer. And that's the part I did on film earlier that I wasn't happy with how I explained what I was doing. And that's why there's tape down here. So what I've got, I have some just printer paper from my computer. And I am going to draw a couple of lines on it. I am going to go up, actually I'm going to draw one line on it. I'm going to go up 1 inch from the bottom of this paper, and I'm going to draw a line. I know that this is a straight edge, so it's okay to do it this way. Alright, I've got to line 1 inch up from the bottom. Is that actually straight? No, it's not. I managed to get that crooked. There. And you can decide if you need to lengthen yours. You can make it however much longer you want. Now, I'm going to actually take a knife and just quickly cut this. It's just quicker and easier to do it this way. It doesn't have to be straight. That piece is going to be taped to the back of our pattern. Now, I'm going to line up the edge of this with that. Since this is a straight line, that's okay. I'm going to line up my cut line with that, and this way I'm adding 1 inch to the length. I may decide to hem out some of that, but I've got the option this way. Take over that. And tape there. And let's do the same thing over here. We can go to the edge, or we could go anywhere in between. Doesn't matter. Then I'm going to tape on the back. Just because this way it stays a little more stable with my pattern. Now you don't have to make your top longer. I just prefer the doll tops to be a little longer. I find a lot of them, they just end at an awkward place. Now, since these have straight lines coming down, I can line this up and just cut it off, even with the edge of my pattern. Line up my cut, my ruler. There. Now my pattern piece is 1 inch longer. So now I have my pattern pieces. I don't need the extension for the hem. I've got these 4 pieces. So now I need to move this to my fabric. So let me get everything set up, and then I'll be back. Alright, this is the fabric I've chosen to use to make the top out of. Now it is a fat quarter. A fat quarter means what they've done is they've cut a 1/2 yard of fabric lengthwise, and then they cut it in half so it's half the width. Fat quarters are a great size to use for doll clothes, as long as you don't have like a wide skirt or something. I decided to use this one because it was on sale, and I thought it would be really cute with the fabric I picked for the pants for this. So I want to pre-wash this. So I'm going to take it to my, I'm not going to run it through the wash or anything. I'm just going to get it wet with hot water, let it get mostly dry, and then finish drying it with my iron. I find that washes out any sizing that might be in the fabric, and it helps to pre-shrink it because we don't want to have this shrink later. So let me get that done, and when it's dry, I'll come back and we'll cut out the pattern. Alright, so here's my fabric after it's been washed. It's dry, and I've pressed it. I've pressed it with right sides facing, and I'm going to pin on the pattern and cut it out, and then next week we'll start sewing. So the first thing we need to do, now there are diagrams, and you can follow the diagrams. That works really well. It's a really good idea if you haven't sewn, but since I've got a fat quarter, it's a little different dimension than what the pattern called for. So we look at our pattern pieces, and these two pieces say center fold on them, and they've got this little arrow thing on them. You see the little arrow? That means that we place it on the fold. Here's the fold of my fabric. So place that edge of the pattern piece right up against that folded edge of your fabric and start pinning. I like to pin once there. Make sure I'm going all the way through. You don't need a huge number of pins, and I'm really at a disadvantage because I've got, normally my head would be right here so I could see that I'm getting everything lined up the way I want it. I'm going to pin through that white printer paper just like I would the tissue. I like to put one in the middle and then one on that fold edge, and then one kind of around each corner. Now this one also needs to be on the fold. And it would be really cool, by the way, another way to vary this would be, it would be kind of neat to do this out of a contrast fabric if you wanted to. There's all kinds of ways you could dress up this pattern to make it, you know, your own creation. And I think I am going to fit it to the Journey Girl later, so maybe we'll do something more creative when we do that. Go through it with that doll. I'm trying to get pins out without poking myself. I used to have a magnetic pin holder that I really loved, but it got something on it, and I need to clean it. So now I'm going to put this one up here. This design on this fabric, it can go any direction, so it's not really, I don't have to, and there's no matching. If this was something like a plaid, I'd need to match it. Now, this arrow, these arrows on these pieces that do not go on the edge, they are very important. And what you need to make sure when you, I'm going to get this all pinned down, and then I'm going to show you a check you need to make before you start cutting. I'm going to dump these pins out so I keep poking myself with the pins. Normally I would just dump them out all over the table, but I was trying to be neat and show you good habits here on this video. You don't have to put in a bunch of pins, just put in enough that you are confident that your pattern piece is not going to move. It's really important. Now, this arrow needs to be parallel to that fold, and yes it is. I can see that I am straight. That needs to be on the straight of grain, in other words going parallel to to that edge, so that your garment will hang correctly. Alright, now I am going to cut out the first couple of pieces, and then I'm going to turn the camera off and, whoops, sorry about that. I'm trying to get that out of my way. And it's best if you put, like I've got fabric left here, I could use this for something else. Try to conserve your fabric. Make sure everything is sitting down flat on the table while you're cutting. I'm going to cut across there so I can get rid of the excess. Make sure I'm under camera. And it's just a matter of carefully cutting around the pattern pieces. You want to cut right at that line. You don't want a big edge hanging off, but you also don't want to cut away your seam allowance, because the seam allowance is marked here, and that's really important as far as fit goes for our pattern. So I'm going to turn the camera off. I'm going to cut the rest of these out, and then I'll come back and we'll just kind of talk about what we've done today. Alright, I have all 4 pattern pieces cut out. There's 2 layers to each of these. This still has the fold intact, so that will be the center front of our shirt. So this week we've talked about all the information on the first page of the instruction sheet. We've talked about our pattern, how to adjust it, and how to cut it out, and how to care for our fabric before we cut it out. Next week we are going to start. We'll do some marking and then we'll start sewing. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Remember, if you have any questions, be sure and ask me. I love to answer questions, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.